one of Jesus' disciples, a guy by the name of John, wrote these words: God is love. God can't help but love. It doesn't mean that God is not aware of our issues or that God is not concerned when we get off track. But what it means that God's primary objective is not policing our bad behavior, but it's bringing grace into that behavior so his love might be seen and experienced by us in the seasons of our life. Now it says he gives former and latter rain. That's an interesting thing. Let me read one other verse, and I'll explain to you what that means. It's in another Old Testament prophet book, the book of Hosea. It says, "Let us pursue the knowledge of the Lord." That's knowing who he really is. His going forth is established. I've written that wrong there, haven't I? His going forth is established. I've written that twice. Forget that. You didn't spot the mistake, neither did I. He's going, just one time, he doesn't stutter. God does not have a stutter, okay? In case you go away and say, Bible's a funny book, you know, God must have a stutter. That was me. It's a typo. His going forth is established. He will come to us like the rain, like the latter and former rain to the earth. In Middle Eastern culture, where, of course, the Bible is written, and most of its analogies and pictures are described from that culture, they have an interesting season of productivity, because after the summer, the ground is hardened by the heat of the sun. The hot summer desert sun has hardened the ground. And it becomes so hard that it would be impossible to begin to plant and expect for the seed that you planted to take root and germinate, in order that when harvest times comes, you would have a harvest to reap, that you would be a blessed person. And so God in his wisdom, God in his kindness, set up within the seasons. Remember how we read in that first one that he sends the former and latter rain in its season, reserves it for the appointed weeks. He sends rain because what happens, those former rains, like uses two old words, the former rain and the latter rain. He sends the former rain, or the first rain, for this reason: because the ground is so hard, it has to be softened in order to receive the seed that will produce the harvest. Now, if the ground is not softened, it cannot receive the seed. If it doesn't receive the seed, when the other rains come, it will not produce a harvest. In fact, what happens is, if the ground were not softened by the former rain, when the latter rains come, which are the harvest rains, they would simply run off the hillsides. Remember that Israel is quite a hilly place. The Middle East, lots of hills. It would simply run down off the hillsides and run away into the streams and away into the rivers and away into the ocean, and would never seep into the ground, and therefore would not be able to cause the seed that was in the ground, if the seed was in the ground, to grow. In fact, what it's really saying is, unless the ground is softened by the former rains, the latter rains' effect will be completely lost. Now, this is telling you something about seasons in life. And it's telling you something about God. God, in his kindness, always sends into our lives in the seasons the former rains and the latter rains. Here's the problem. When we do not allow the former rains of God, the things that God does, the things that God says, that sometimes we don't even recognize are God. There may just be a kindness here. It may be a word of help and knowledge and instruction there in the middle of our issues. When we don't allow that to seep into the soil of our life and the soil of our heart, what happens is our heart remains hard. And in fact, because we don't allow the softening rains to soften our hearts become harder and harder. And then the problem is, when we get the rains that would produce the harvest in our life, they simply run off us, and we don't even recognize hardly that God was doing anything in our lives, because we never allowed our hearts to be softened. Before God does anything in the life of a man or the life of a woman, he first begins to do things to soften your heart. Our problem is, we often resist what God does to soften our heart. And we allow our hearts to remain hard. We have excuses and we have reasons. And in those excuses and reasons, and preserving our identity or looking after our reputation, or the fact that we just want to do our own thing and won't give up our will, what happens is that we allow our hearts and the soil of our hearts and our lives to remain hard in a season when they should be softened. And because we didn't take that opportunity, when the seed that would be planted in us that would bring a harvest and change our life is tried to be put in the ground, first of all, if it does get in, it doesn't go very deep. And then when those latter rains come, the rains run off our lives and we finish up with no harvest. You see, God's desire is not that your life be lost in a circle of events. If in Genesis it had said summer and winter, springtime and autumn, it would be condemning you to live life just in a circle of events that said sometimes it'll be good, sometimes it'll be bad, but that's just life. But God never condemned us to live life in a circle of events. He said, I don't want you to live in a circle. I want you to live in a cycle of productivity. Because if you will do it my way, what will happen is although the seasons of life come up on you, and sometimes it's like winter and sometimes it's like the heat of summer, if you will follow the process that I've released into the earth, your life will be productive ground. Your heart will be productive. Your life will be whole. You won't live in famine and drought, but you'll live in productivity and plenty. And you will have a harvest that God desired to be in your life. Probably the greatest obstacle to the value of productivity of the seasons in our lives is the unwillingness to let our hearts be softened. Is that you? Have you, because of your issues, because of your wounds, because of your disappointments, because you didn't get your own way, because things are tough, have you actually been unwilling to let your heart be softened? Because I'll guarantee you something. God says, as long as the earth remains, I will send the former rain and the latter rain. As long as the earth remains. God is right now sending the rains that soften your heart in words, in deeds, in events, in things he wants to show you. But if you ignore it, if you don't allow your heart to be softened, that will be the greatest obstacle in you to the value and productivity of the seasons that you're going through. If we won't allow our hearts to be softened, then we won't allow our hearts to be changed. The whole issue of seasons will change your life if you will submit to what God has put into the process of those seasons. 7 years ago on Monday, I entered a terrible season of life. And I remember sitting, it was the longest day in many ways, but on the longest day I was sat through the middle of the night. And God began to speak to me in that difficult season about the softening of my heart. Now, it's the last thing I wanted to hear, because in the process I was going through, my desire was to apportion blame. My desire was to give excuses. My desire was to try and deal with the pain I was in and the difficulty I was going through. But God began to speak to me in that night, because it was the softening rains of God. And God said something to me. He said, your heart's breaking, isn't it? And I said, it is. And God says, it's because your heart's hard. Now, I didn't want to hear that. It wasn't my fault. But God said something interesting to me. He said, you see, only hard hearts break. You can't break something that's soft. Now, something that's soft wounds, but wounds heal. And God said to me that night, he said, if you will allow me to soften your heart, you will feel the wounds, but the wounds will heal. And then you'll have no pain, but your heart will be whole. And instead of you living the rest of your life as a broken person, unable to live through the seasons, you'll be made whole and be made well. Question is tonight, simply this. Will you let God soften your heart? Because that's the key to productivity. That's the key to your life coming through the seasons and bringing forth a harvest in every way. Will you let your heart be softened?